when the UCAT is a test that can seemingly decide our entire futures, and when there is so little information out there on how we can actually learn how to do well on it, it's no wonder that many of us worry that we aren't good enough to do well on the test, or that it's just another IQ test that some of us are just not meant to pass. In reality, I really believe that with proper strategy, you can do well on the UCAT without having a genius IQ. So if you want to get into medical school, these are the strategies that I and many other students have used to score extremely well on the UCAT. Let's get straight into it with verbal reasoning. Let's say you have to answer one set of questions from the verbal reasoning subtest. You can either choose this long and very detailed passage or this short and not very detailed passage. If you're anything like a reasonable person, you'd probably choose the shorter and less detailed passage. And the reason this is important is that it highlights that not all verbal reasoning passages are built the same. One passage could be 10 times harder than another and could take 5 to 10 minutes to complete, but it would still be worth the same amount of marks as a passage that takes you 1 minute to finish. This is why it's so important to always practice skipping questions in verbal reasoning, and I would encourage that you do this even with the first set of questions every time you do the subtest. When you're practicing, always skip the first set of passages so that you enter the subtest thinking about how you're going to be managing your time very effectively. Learning how to skip the right questions is also a skill, so practice being able to recognize easy and hard passages either through length, the content, and the level of detail, and then also practice being able to recognize easy and hard questions. The easier questions in verbal reasoning tend to be the ones that require some sort of verification of a fact, which you can just find in the passage. Whereas questions that are harder tend to be ones that require you to understand the whole passage, like author's intention, or the passage would most likely agree with this statement. This leads us on to the idea that in verbal reasoning, you want to be aiming for accuracy, not speed. What a lot of people do is that they assume that all 44 questions in the verbal reasoning subtest need to be answered within the same amount of time. In reality, you want to be spending slightly more time on the easy questions so that you're able to get them with a very high degree of accuracy, because the hard questions you're probably not that likely to get anyway. If you lose marks on the easy questions, it will be much harder to do well. This leads me on to talk about the big boss of verbal reasoning, which is how you actually read. It's really important to develop a good reading technique for verbal reasoning, and this involves a balance of being able to scan, but then also to read slowly and absorb information. There isn't enough time to read the entire passage in excruciating detail, and there also isn't enough time to be scanning the same passage multiple times in every question because you haven't absorbed anything. In my opinion, best reading technique involves being able to read through the passage fast enough that you can get through the entire thing, but then also reading it slow enough that you can landmark parts of the passage that you feel like change tone or have important parts of information. Being able to do this, I think, allows you to have a very nice balance of reading fast enough, but not too quickly. Developing that good reading technique is actually a skill that you can work on, and that leads me on to talk about one of the most important skills in the UCAT, which is systematic improvement. Doing well on the UCAT is like driving from one city to the next, but there's a bunch of traffic on the road. If I gave you two options, one, stay on the road and try to force yourself through the traffic, or two, take some of the side streets, experiment with how you're going, and try to get to point B without going through the traffic, most people would pick option two. The problem is that most people approach the UCAT trying to force themselves through the traffic by just doing practice problems again and again and again. Doing so many practice problems can be good while the traffic isn't that bad, but when the traffic starts to get worse and your progress slows down, doing more practice problems is never going to fix anything. The thing to realize is that practice makes permanent, not perfect, and just doing tons and tons of practice problems will just encourage you to keep your bad habits. On another note, doing that many practice problems just feels like a grind, and it's quite depressing to do. The solution to this is to make sure you have a system for improving. After you complete any exam or subtest, instead of casting aside your mistakes as silly errors or just not having enough time, actually take the time to review your performance on those exams. Reflect on everything that you possibly can. How you were feeling before the test, how you were feeling during the test, what things sort of made you have that mistake, and whether you've made that type of mistake before. Over the course of an exam or a subtest, try and find patterns in the way that you make mistakes. Once you've found the pattern, you can focus in on that. And I would recommend always trying to find just one thing that you can improve on when you do your next subtest. When you do your next subtest, focus in on just that one thing and trying to be better at that. And that's also the reason why you don't want to pick too many, because then you can just get overwhelmed. This leads us on to talk about the next subtest in the UCAT, decision making. Decision making has many different question types, and as a result, one of the best things that you can do to prepare is to make yourself very familiar with all of those types. Each of them tends to have a slightly different strategy, so it's important to learn them all individually. After that, when you do practice, you'll realize that you tend to struggle on certain question types more than others, so make sure you target your practice to those question types that you struggle with. The other quick tip that I have for decision making is to write things down. Decision making is one of those subtests where if you keep everything in your head, you'll be struggling enormously because you just won't be able to manage. The notepad is a very good tool that you have, so make sure you're writing down your working out on the notepad as you're doing the DM subtest. The next thing that I'll talk about is which practice platform you should use to prepare. In all honesty, I think pretty much all of the UCAT preparation companies replicate the test pretty well these days. So the differentiating factor tends to be their price, their customer service, and how well the LMS is designed. I usually don't recommend UCAT programs, tutoring, or courses where you have to stick to a very strict schedule or there's some sort of person who's teaching you how to do things. The reason for this is that often the majority of improvement needs to be done yourself through that process of reflection and systematic improvement rather than someone telling you what to do. When you have someone telling you what to do, you can tend to get a bit lazy and they're not able to self-diagnose and find your own problems to then fix. I understand that it's less expensive, but I would also encourage against buying packages that last for 1 to 2 months. And the reason for this is that if your UCAT ends up getting delayed for whatever reason, or if you personally feel like you need to delay your UCAT more, these packages can end up costing a lot more money than if you had just bought a season pass to begin with. But obviously, if you're willing to tolerate that risk, then it is worth buying only a 1 to 2 month package if it's cheaper. This video is not sponsored, but full disclosure, I have been a MedEntry affiliate and they have sponsored my videos in the past. But I recommend them because I think they have a good service. I recommend them to my friends and my family when they ask me. And I also have a 15% discount link down in the description below that you can access if you want. The next subtest is quantitative reasoning, and this is one that you can absolutely get so much better at regardless of how good you are at maths. The first thing that you want to do is identify the gaps that you have in your mathematical knowledge. In general, the quantitative reasoning subtest has maths to the level that most people are forced to study in school due to compulsory classes or whatever. As a result, I would encourage you to just go through a quantitative reasoning subtest and have a look at all of the questions and try to identify what type of maths they require you to use. Make a list and take notes of the ones that appear the most. And when you're doing this, I would really encourage that you don't ask anyone else for their list of questions. Just try to make it yourself, because the process of being able to understand what type of maths a question is asking you is actually a very different type of skill from being able to actually do the maths. After that, you'll hopefully have this long list of maths questions that they can ask you in the quantitative reasoning subtest. And then you can go on Google and search up that type of question and do some practice questions to see how well you understand the concepts. Doing this will mean you can brush up on your basic mathematical skills, and then you'll also be able to speed up very, very quickly. The next thing in the QR subtest is to learn how to use the calculator very quickly and effectively. I would say that it's important to never ever practice the QR subtest without using the calculator, because on the real test day, that's what you're going to have, and it is nothing like your normal average calculator. When you're using the calculator, learn how to use the number pad as well, and then also learn the keyboard shortcuts that you can use to navigate the calculator very quickly. As with the verbal reasoning subtest and almost all of the subtests in general, when you're doing a subtest, make sure that you're skipping questions, because not all questions are created equal. The specific thing here is to be able to quickly realize when a certain question might require multiple mathematical calculations as opposed to just one or two. This leads me on to talk about how you can manage balancing your UCAT preparation with your schoolwork or coursework. When I was practicing for the UCAT, I was also doing my final year of high school alongside the UCAT, and many of you will be in the same boat, and it makes everything just much harder. What I found was most useful was to double down on the Pareto principle, which is that 80% of the results of anything will come from 20% of the effort. With the UCAT, 20% of the effort is really those short bursts of extremely focused practice, which is much better than doing practice questions for hours on end. It's also important though to apply this principle to your schoolwork, because with your schoolwork there will also be tasks that are far less productive for your learning than others. In many cases this means that doing homework is not that useful, and instead learning very key concepts thoroughly or doing practice questions can be far more beneficial. This isn't just important for the UCAT or schoolwork, this is an important life skill that you'll have to learn eventually if you want to be able to balance things in life. Learn to prioritize the tasks that are most important for your school and also for the UCAT. And sometimes this will mean only doing 2 to 4 hours of UCAT practice a week, but making sure that that 2 to 4 hours is as productive as it can possibly be. The Pareto principle is also one that applies to the next subtest, the abstract reasoning subtest, very well. When you're studying for this subtest, make sure you're focusing on the 20% of easy, simple patterns that tend to make up 80% of the marks. Most subtests will have a majority of relatively easy patterns that are very achievable to do, and then 1 or 2 extremely hard ones. As a result, if you're doing a subtest and you get 4 to 5 sets of patterns wrong, don't focus on the 1 or 2 that are insanely hard and you would have to spend 10 hours looking at it just to get it. Focus on the ones that have more of the type of relatively easy patterns. What I did was, when I found out that I got one thing wrong that was pretty easy, for example the number of sides, I would do a series of practice questions, and the first thing that I would look for would be the number of sides, and then I would look for everything else. Doing this allowed me to consciously think about looking for those patterns, and over time with practice this became a subconscious skill that allowed me to find the patterns very quickly. When you focus on one set of common patterns after another, you'll quickly realize that common patterns come up commonly, and you'll be able to do much better in the subtest. Please don't spend hours and hours on the very hard questions, because you'll probably never see them again, and they're pretty hard to get. As with every other subtest, you also want to be able to skip questions in the abstract reasoning subtest. And the other thing that I would recommend doing is figuring out the rarer question types that usually happen at the end of the subtest. Those ones are actually pretty easy to do once you crack the skill of understanding how to do them quickly, so they can be pretty free marks. And the next big question that I get is, how many practice questions should I do? I've talked a lot about quality over quantity, but there are a few general rules that I would recommend in regards to practice questions. If you've done 0 practice exams and you're kind of waiting to do a practice exam until you've learned the theory or until you've done a few subtests, throw that mindset away and try and do a practice exam as soon as you possibly can. Your score will probably be terrible, but it will give you an idea of what the exam is really like. Even if your score is literally in the first percentile and 99% of people did better than you, I would still think of this as a win, because this gives you a starting point that you can work from. When you do a practice exam early, you can see how much you improve, and that becomes a very good inherent motivator for you to practice. On the other hand, if you've done quite a few exams, I would really encourage you to slow down and think about how much you're reviewing your progress after each exam. I would stop, take stock of all of the exams and practice questions you've done previously, review them and find patterns in the things that you've gotten wrong. Try and find the 20% of things you can work on to get the 80% of the results. Everyone always wants to know how many exams I did, and personally I did around 10 to 15 exams in total. This leads us on to the next subtest, situational judgment. With situational judgment, start by learning the key ethical principles of beneficence, non-maleficence, justice and autonomy, because these will give you a very strong backbone that you can work from in the questions. In my opinion, it's probably a good idea to always practice trying to figure out whether something is important or not important, or appropriate or not appropriate in general before you try and hone in on a specific answer. This will generally give you some practice honing in your ethical radar, and then you can finally try to start to learn what the key issues are in any scenario and weighing them and figuring out which one is more important than another. It's also a good idea to think about ethical dilemmas that occur inside and outside of medicine in general, in society, and having a look at how people discuss those to generate your ethical compass. This will also help you for interviews when you get there, because you're watching this video. The final thing that I think is important to understand about the UCAT in general is that if you want to be a medical student, you need to be able to think and act like a medical student as well. This is far beyond the actual academic pursuits of a medical student, but it goes into things like motivation, drive, and resilience, and you can find out all about those in this video here.